If you enjoy dark mysteries, stories that seem real, and cases that leave you wondering, subscribe to the channel now, because here you'll find all that, and much more. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I love knowing how far these stories are going, and who is following every detail with me. The mansion stood imposingly against the grey skies of North Carolina, its Gothic contours cutting through the mist like a presence that seemed to watch anyone who dared approach. Biltmore Estate. The church, known for its historical grandeur, carried a silence that wasn't merely due to the momentary abandonment of its corridors. It was a dense silence, laden with something that seemed to resist time. That morning, the iron gates slowly opened after decades of restricted access to certain wings of the property, not for restoration, not for tourism, but because of a dead man. His name was Arthur Calloway, a real estate tycoon known for acquiring old properties and transforming them into luxury developments. His fortune didn't just come from business deals, it came from cold, calculated decisions, often shrouded in controversy. To some, a visionary. To others, a silent predator. And now, a corpse. Arthur had bought the oldest wing of the property months earlier, insisting on keeping intact structures that not even the mansion's administrators dared to explore. Especially the basement. The basement! Employees reported that he spent hours down there, alone, without staff, without security, without explanations. On the night of his death, a storm struck the region with unusual violence. Lightning illuminated the mansion's tall windows, while the wind made ancient doors rattle in their hinges. No staff remained in the isolated wing. It was a direct request from Arthur himself. Nobody should be there, but something was wrong. The body was found the following morning, lying near the basement entrance. Its eyes were open, fixed on something no one else could see. Its expression was frozen in such absolute terror, it seemed to have been carved into its face. There were no signs of a struggle, no injuries, no apparent cause. Only one thing stood out. Arthur's hands were covered in damp earth, as if he had tried to dig something up, or get out of somewhere. That's when they called Daniel Hayes, a private investigator specializing in cases where logic fails, a former police officer dismissed after insisting on following leads his superiors considered impossible. Daniel didn't easily believe in coincidences, and even less in poorly told stories. Upon arriving at the property, the first thing he noticed was not its grandeur. It was the smell. Wet earth, even though it wasn't raining at that moment. The estate manager, a stern man named Leonard Briggs, greeted Daniel with evident discomfort. He didn't just seem concerned about the death, he seemed anxious to get the matter over with quickly. "It was a heart attack," he said dryly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the entrance hall, observing details that few would notice. Subtle marks on the floor, small irregularities in the walls, an environment that seemed altered. "Then why did you call me?" he finally asked. Briggs hesitated. "1 second, that's too long, because there were reports." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "What kind of stories?" The administrator looked away. "Noises. During the night, coming from the basement." The silence that followed was heavy. "Before death?" Daniel asked. "And then?" The answer echoed in the empty space. Daniel sensed something familiar, not fear, but recognition. Cases like this never began with clear answers. There was always something hidden, something buried, literal or not. And on that property, it seemed as if something had been disturbed. As he walked through the corridors, he noticed another unsettling detail. Some doors were marked on the inside, as if someone had tried to leave and not enter. As he approached the staircase leading to the basement, the air grew colder. It wasn't a subjective sensation. It was physical, heavy, denso, as if the space itself resisted the human presence. "No one has gone down there since yesterday," Briggs said, his voice now lower. Daniel stopped in front of the door. Old wood, scratches, recent. He touched the surface, and for a brief moment he had the impression of feeling a vibration, as if something were on the other side, waiting. Was he alone when he died? Daniel asked, without taking his hand off the door. Yes, he is sure. Briggs did not respond immediately, and that was enough. Daniel turned the doorknob. The door creaked slowly. A long sound, dragged, and when it opened, it revealed the darkness of the basement and an emptiness that seemed to swallow the light around it. The smell of earth grew stronger, much stronger. And there was something else, a sound, very low, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Something is moving. Daniel did not enter immediately, because at that moment he understood one thing with absolute clarity. Arthur Calloway did not die of natural causes, and whatever was in that basement, it was still there. Daniel Hayes didn't immediately enter the basement. Instead, he took a step back and closed the door as slowly as he had opened it. The decision wasn't born of fear, but of method. He had learned over the years that places like this shouldn't be approached impulsively. First, you needed to understand the setting, then the people. Only then, whatever was hidden between the two. Biltmore wasn't just a mansion. It was practically a private city, built in the late 19th century, with wings that had been closed off, modified, or simply forgotten over the decades. There were too many stories in that place, and Daniel knew that when stories accumulate without explanation, they tend to transform into something more dense. He started with the employees. Most avoided eye contact. Some responded quickly. Others hesitated, as if each word needed to be carefully measured. It wasn't just the weight of the recent death. It was something older, more deeply rooted. One of the employees, Margaret Ellison, a housekeeper for over 20 years, was the first to show anything close to sincerity. Her face bore the weariness of someone who had seen too much and remained silent for too long. "That wing should never have been opened," she said quietly, as she arranged silverware on a table that was far too long for the current number of residents. Daniel leaned slightly on the edge of the table. "Why?" Margaret paused for a moment. Her fingers remained on the cold silver, because it wasn't closed by accident. She didn't look at him when she said that. What was down there? Silence. A silence heavier than any answer. Before Mr. Calloway bought that part of the property, there were old records being catalogued, she continued finally. Plans, documents, diaries, many of them incomplete. Incomplete how? Pages torn out, dates erased, references to reforms that were never officially recorded. Daniel absorbed every word. "And nobody questioned that?" Margaret let out a slight dry laugh. "Here, Mr. Hayes, people learn not to ask certain questions." The answer didn't sound like superstition. It sounded like a rule. Later, Daniel encountered another key character, Thomas Reed, the property's maintenance man. Unlike Margaret, he showed resistance, not out of obvious fear, but out of distrust. "I don't believe those stories," he said, crossing his arms, but his stance did not fully support the claim. "Then explain the noises," Daniel said. Thomas hesitated. "Old pipes, wooden structure. This house breathes." "Houses don't scratch doors from the inside," Daniel replied bluntly. Thomas's gaze hardened. "Did you see that?" "I saw enough." There was a tense moment. So Thomas gave in, not completely, but enough. "He meddled where he shouldn't have," he said, referring to Arthur. "He started digging." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Dig what?" "I don't know exactly, but he brought equipment. Discreetly. He worked alone, mostly at night, and nobody found that strange." "We think so. But he paid well to avoid being interrupted. Money could buy silence, but it couldn't erase the consequences. Throughout the day, Daniel pieced together fragments, small details that, in isolation, didn't say much, but together they began to form something unsettling. The basement wing had undergone renovations in the early 20th century, following an incident that was never officially documented. Some records mentioned structural instability. Others spoke of acoustic interference, terms too vague to be technical, too specific to be ignored. There were also indirect reports of workers who abandoned their jobs suddenly, without warning, without final payment, unreported disappearances, nothing official, but it's frequent enough to raise patterns. And then there was Arthur Calloway. Unlike other owners, he didn't try to transform the mansion. He didn't try to completely modernize it. He seemed interested in something specific, something that was already there. In the makeshift office Arthur had set up, Daniel found old maps of the property, some of them overlaid with recent annotations, lines marked by hand, circles in underground areas, and at the center of it all, the basement. There was also a notebook, few pages written, irregular handwriting, different from the precise standard expected of someone like Arthur. The last notes were fragmented. It's not empty. They didn't leave. It's deeper than I thought. And finally, it's not a place. It's a passage. Daniel slowly closed the notebook. That didn't seem like ordinary paranoia. There was consistency in the pattern, a progression, as if Arthur had started with curiosity and ended with certainty. The question was, certainty about what? As night fell, the mansion changed. Not visibly, but noticeably. The corridors seemed longer, the silence more present, and the air heavier. Daniel returned to the basement door. This time he didn't hesitate as much, but before he could open it, something made him stop. A simple detail, the earth on the ground. It wasn't just near the door. She was being pulled in fine lines, as if something was being dragged from the inside out. He crouched down, touching the surface. Wet, recent, very recent. Then he listened again. Oh, I am. Much clearer now. A slow drag, irregular, and for a brief moment something more. A pattern. Almost like beats from the inside. Daniel stood up slowly. His eyes were fixed on the door. And for the first time since arriving at the property, he wasn't just analyzing. I was considering a possibility that I had avoided for years. Perhaps that wasn't just an isolated incident. Perhaps it was something that should never have been found. Daniel didn't wait for dawn. Unlike the first time when he stepped back to observe, now he knew that time was not an ally. There was something active in that place, not just a vestige of the past, but a presence in motion. And the more time passed, the harder it would be to distinguish what was evidence from what was influence. He opened the basement door firmly. The darkness received him as a living entity. This time he went in. The air inside was colder than before, so heavy that it made breathing difficult. It wasn't just humidity. It was density, as if the space were saturated with something invisible. The staircase creaked under his footsteps, each rung echoing louder than it should. Reaching the top, the flashlight's beam revealed a rugged environment. Far from a simple structural basement, there were makeshift tunnels, recently broken walls, and excavation marks made without any regard for safety. Arthur wasn't exploring. I was looking for it. Daniel advanced cautiously, illuminating the ground. Brands, many brands, some human, others don't. They weren't clear footprints, but distorted impressions, as if something had dragged itself using more than one point of support. Too irregular to be identified as tools, too organic to be ignored. The smell of earth was suffocating down there. But there was another odor mixed in, something old, closed, like a space that was sealed off for too long and was forcibly opened. He followed the main tunnel, and then he found it. The excavation point, a larger opening where earth had been heavily removed. Abandoned equipment was scattered, shovels, broken lanterns, ropes still attached to makeshift structures, and in the center, a hole. Not very wide, but too profound to be natural. Daniel approached slowly. The flashlight beam descended, and didn't reach the bottom. He leaned forward, trying to capture some detail, and then he listened. Coming from below, a muffled sound, like air being pulled through something narrow, but rhythmic. Too regular, almost like breathing. Daniel immediately retreated. Instinct prevailed over reason at that moment. He took a few steps back, assessing his surroundings. The walls around the hole were marked, not by tools, because of scratches, from the inside out. That didn't make sense. If Arthur was digging downwards, why were there marks going up? A noise echoed through the tunnel. This time, it didn't come from the hole, it came from behind. Daniel turned around quickly, pointing the flashlight. Nothing, but the sound had been clear. Something is moving between the tunnels. He turned off the flashlight for a second. Absolute silence. So, in the dark, the sound became more evident. Drag. This is it. Irregular. Closer than before. Daniel turned the light back on, turning his body around. Empty. But now he was certain he was not alone. Logic demanded an explanation. An animal, perhaps. Some structural flaw. A distorted echo. But the pattern of the sounds didn't match anything known. And then he realized something even worse. The tunnels were not static. The layout of the excavations. It looked different. He took a few steps back, trying to locate the exact path he had taken in. But there were more forks in the road than before, or he hadn't noticed, or they weren't there before. A faint thud echoed in the distance, like something hitting against wood. Daniel followed the sound, ignoring the instinct to retreat. The tunnel narrowed, forcing him to lower himself slightly. The light revealed an old wall, part of the mansion's original structure. But there was a door there, a door that didn't appear on any of the plans. Closed, partially covered by soil, and marked. Deep scratches, concentrated at the height of a human hand, but too many. It was as if several hands had tried to reach out at the same time. Daniel approached, and then he saw something trapped between the cracks in the wood. A piece of fabric. He pulled carefully. It was recent, part of a shirt, recognizable. It belonged to Arthur. Daniel's heart raced. That meant one thing. Arthur didn't just die near the basement. He was there. At that point, trying to get out, or trying to keep something inside. The sound is back, stronger now, behind the door. A hit, then another one, slow, heavy, deliberate. Daniel stood motionless, observing, waiting. The third hit came with more force. The wood vibrated slightly, and for a brief second, there was silence. Absolute silence. Then something scraped against the other side. Slowly. Going up, like fingernails, looking for an opening. Daniel took a step back, but the conflict within him was no longer just professional. It was personal. That challenged everything he accepted as reality. And yet, it was there. Concrete. Undeniable. He raised his hand toward the doorknob, not out of courage, but because I needed to know. And the instant his fingers touched the metal, the beating stopped, completely, as if whatever was on the other side, I knew, and was waiting. Daniel didn't open the door. Not at that moment. He slowly removed his hand from the doorknob, keeping his eyes fixed on the marked wood. The decision wasn't to retreat, it was strategy. The pattern was forming, and acting without understanding it could mean not getting out of there. He backed away through the tunnel, now attentive to every detail. The atmosphere seemed more oppressive than before, as if the structure itself were reacting to his presence. When he finally reached the stairs and returned to the main level, the feeling of heaviness lessened, but did not disappear completely. The house had changed, or he had. That night, Daniel decided not to leave the property. He settled into one of the rooms in the main wing, keeping with him Arthur's notebook, the piece of fabric found on the door, and a map that he was beginning to redraw manually based on what he had seen in the basement. But there was something wrong with the map. The dimensions didn't match. The tunnels he walked through didn't correspond to the physical space of the mansion. It was as if there were larger areas below than the structure would allow. That wasn't just excavation. It was an expansion, and this raised a disturbing hypothesis. Either Arthur had found something that already existed, or he had gained access to something that shouldn't be there. Shortly after midnight, Daniel heard footsteps in the hallway. They weren't fast, nor were they stealthy. They were slow, regulars, like someone who wasn't in a hurry or who knew exactly where they were. He opened the door. The hallway was empty, but on the ground there were marks. Small amounts of soil scattered at irregular intervals, forming a path, heading towards the isolated wing. Daniel followed. Each step revealed more traces, small mounds of damp earth, as if something had been transported or dragged. There were no clear footprints, only the trail. When he reached the basement staircase, he found someone. Margaret. Property. Facing the door. "You shouldn't be here," Daniel said firmly. She didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the wood. "He started listening too," she murmured. "Who?" "Mr. Calloway." Daniel approached. "Listen to what?" Margaret finally turned her face away. There was something different about her. It wasn't fear, it was acceptance. Calls. The word hung in the air. "Where are the calls coming from?" Daniel insisted. She pointed slowly towards the ground. Underneath. The silence that followed was broken by a sound coming from the door itself. A light touch, like someone testing. Daniel observed Margaret. "Have you heard this before?" She nodded. "Years ago." "What happened?" "They closed." "Who?" "The first owners. Then others kept it that way." Daniel quickly connected the pieces. That reform at the beginning of the century, it wasn't due to structural instability, was it? Margaret shook her head slowly. It was containment. The word resonated with more weight than any technical explanation. Before Daniel could answer, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. Thomas appeared, visibly upset. "Did you mess around down there again?" he asked, looking directly at Daniel. "Enough," he replied. Thomas nervously ran a hand over his face. "Then you need to see this." Without waiting for an answer, he started walking. Daniel exchanged one last look with Margaret before following him. They went to the side wing of the mansion, a rarely used part of the building. Thomas opened a locked door, revealing an old archive room. "I didn't want to mess with this," he said, "but after yesterday..." He pulled out an old wooden box. Inside, there were sealed documents, old photos, and a diary, much older than Arthur's. Daniel opened the diary. The pages were yellowed, but legible. Accounts from an engineer in charge of underground construction on the property, dating from the early 1900s. The notes were technical at first: excavation, winery expansion, structural reinforcement. But over time, the tone changed. "We found a cavity that was larger than expected. Workers refused to continue. The sound doesn't come from outside." The last pages were the most disturbing. "We sealed the main entrance. But it's not enough. He's not trying to get in. He's trying to leave." Daniel slowly closed the diary. The pattern repeated itself. Arthur wasn't the first, just the most recent one. "This never came to light," Thomas said. "Never, because it was never resolved," Daniel replied. The sound came again, this time not far away. It echoed through the structure of the house, a dull thud, coming from below. The lights flickered briefly. Margaret appeared at the door. "It's already started," she said. Daniel turned his gaze to Thomas. "What started?" But he already knew the answer. The earth was not being removed by chance. The tunnels weren't expanding for no reason. And Arthur wasn't digging to find anything. He was being guided. And now, whatever it was no longer contained. The impact coming from underground was not an isolated event. He repeated himself, this time stronger. The mansion's structure responded with a slight tremor, almost imperceptible to an inattentive observer. But Daniel wasn't that kind of person. He felt it. Just as he felt something even more disturbing. It didn't seem like a collapse. It seemed like Insistence. "This has never happened like this before," Thomas said, his voice tense. Margaret remained silent, but her gaze confirmed otherwise. Daniel wasted no time. "Show me all the entrances to the basement. Now." Thomas hesitated. "It's not just those stairs. There are old access points. Some have been sealed off." "So let's open it." The response was immediate. No room for discussion. Minutes later, the three walked through a forgotten wing of the property, where old doors had been sealed with boards and nails corroded by time. The first entrance was opened with effort. The smell that escaped from there was not just mold. It was the same smell, earth, but more focused, more alive. Daniel went down first. The environment was different from what I had explored before. Less excavated, older. The stone walls were original, but marked not by recent tools, but by uneven wear, as if something had passed over them repeatedly over many years. The tunnel led to a larger chamber. And there, for the first time, everything made sense in a way that made the situation even worse. There wasn't just one excavation point. There were several, interconnected. As a system, as if that space had been expanded around something central, and in the middle of the camera, there was a structure, unnatural, not entirely artificial. It was an ancient stone arch, partially buried, covered by layers of compacted earth. Worn symbols marked its surface. They weren't decorative. They seemed functional. They were setting the boundaries. They contained. "That's not in the plants," Thomas murmured. Daniel approached slowly. The symbols were not recognizable, but they had a pattern, sequence, repetition, and most importantly, continuity. They didn't end at the arch. They continued along the land, as if something had been buried there and marked around it. "This has been sealed," Daniel said, almost to himself. Margaret stepped forward. It was more than sealed. What was it? She hesitated. It was maintained. Silence fell over the room. Then came the sound, straight from the arch. It wasn't far away anymore, not even stuffy. It was clear, a slow scratching, coming from within the compacted earth. Daniel illuminated the base of the structure, and then he saw an opening, small, recent. The ground around was broken, pushed from the inside out. "Arthur did it," Thomas said, almost whispering. Daniel did not answer. He was already analyzing something else, something more important, the brands at the edge of the opening. They weren't tools. They were deep, irregular, and they climbed up the rock, from the inside out, as if something had used force and persistence. Then Margaret spoke. He opened it. Daniel turned to her, and what was closed. But she didn't answer, because at that moment, the bow vibrated, not as a structure, but as a tensioned surface. The earth fell into small fragments. And the opening, it increased. A sound emerged from there, unlike anything they had ever heard before. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't mechanical, it was multiple, overlaid, like multiple sounds trying to exist at the same time. Thomas stepped back. "That's not possible." But Daniel did not move. He was watching, connecting, understanding. The old diary, the reforms, the disappearances. Arthur. Everything pointed to the same thing. That was not a creature, not in the usual sense. It was something restrained, something that didn't belong in that space, but was trapped there. And then, finally, the last piece fell into place. Arthur wasn't digging to find riches, not a historical secret. He was responding to something. Something caught his attention, and now it had an opening. The sound stopped abruptly. Total silence, heavy, unreal, and slowly. Something came up at the opening, not entirely, just enough. One way, undefined, dark, but with its own movement, as if darkness had density. Thomas let out an involuntary sound. Margaret closed her eyes, and Daniel. He remained motionless, because at that moment he understood. It wasn't trying to force its way out. I was testing it, learning, and above all, acknowledging. The form receded slowly, disappearing again at the opening, but before disappearing completely, the sound returned. That's clearer, closer, and, for the first time, with meaning. It wasn't a random noise. It was rhythm, structure, almost language. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine, because it wasn't just something trying to get out. It was something trying to communicate. Arthur Calloway, he didn't die of fright. He died after understanding. The silence following the retreat of the form brought no relief. It brought expectation. Daniel was the first to move. Slowly, he approached the structure again, keeping his flashlight fixed on the opening. The earth was still shifting in small fragments, as if something inside had merely changed position, not gone away. "This can't stay like this," Thomas said, his voice low but heavy with urgency. "We need to shut this down. Now." Margaret didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the symbols of the arch, as if trying to remember something that had never been completely forgotten. "It's not that simple," she murmured. Daniel remained silent for a few seconds, analyzing the pattern of the symbols, the position of the opening, the markings around it. "She's right," he finally said. "This has been shut down before, and yet it came back." Thomas ran his hand through his hair, clearly shaken. "So what do you suggest? Leave it open?" "No," Daniel replied directly, "but we're not going to repeat their mistake either." "What mistake?" Daniel looked at the opening, closing without understanding. The impact came again, stronger. This time the floor vibrated noticeably. Small pieces of earth fell from the chamber's ceiling. Thomas recoiled immediately, almost losing his balance. "This is getting worse," he exclaimed. Daniel observed the structure's reaction. The bow was not giving way. I was replying, as if each impact were a coordinated attempt. "It's not brute force," he said. "It's rhythm." Margaret looked up. "Like this? That thing inside isn't just trying to get out. It's testing limits, repeating patterns, looking for flaws. The sound is back, this time faster, sequential. 3 short beats, a pause, 2 longer beats." Daniel froze for a moment. "This is not random." Thomas looked at him, confused. "Are you saying that this... you think?" Daniel did not answer directly, but his expression already said enough. They needed to get out of there, now. "Let's go," he said firmly. "This place isn't safe." The 3 retreated through the tunnel, now in a hurry. The atmosphere seemed more unstable, as if their presence had accelerated something inevitable. Upon reaching the stairs and climbing to the main level, the feeling of relief was immediate, but brief, because the sound didn't get left behind. A faint echo still lingered within the house, as if it had found another way to manifest itself. Upon reaching the main corridor, Thomas stopped abruptly. "Are you listening to this?" Daniel nodded. It no longer came from the ground. It came from the walls, a subtle sound, almost imperceptible, scratching, spreading. Margaret put her hand to her mouth. "This has never happened before." Daniel turned slowly, taking in his surroundings. The entire house was being affected. "The opening didn't just free up space," he said. "It freed up reach." The landline phone in the hallway started making a strange noise. It wasn't a ring, nor was it regular interference. It was a continuous, distorted sound. Thomas approached hesitantly and took the phone off the hook. The sound got louder, transforming into something more defined. Sequences, standards, the same rhythm. Daniel approached quickly. "Place not out loud!" Thomas obeyed, his hands trembling. The sound filled the room. Now it's clearer, more organized, and then the breakdown came. Among the patterns, something emerged. A fragment, not perfect, but recognizable. A sound that didn't belong in that sequence. An attempt, an imitation. "One word, open." Margaret immediately recoiled, visibly shaken. Thomas dropped the device. The impact echoed off the ground, but no one reacted, because everyone heard it, with sufficient clarity. Daniel remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the phone. That confirmed it, without a doubt. It wasn't just a presence. It was a conscious decision. And more than that, I was learning. He succeeded, Margaret murmured. Daniel turned around slowly. Who? Arthur. Silence returned, heavy with emotion. He answered, she continued. He heard that, and he answered. Daniel felt the connection forming, and in answering, he taught. Margaret nodded, almost imperceptibly. And now, she knows. The sound stopped abruptly. Once again, silence filled the mansion, but this time there was no doubt. That was no longer confined to the basement. He was no longer bound to the land. It was in the structure, in the spaces. We echo. And maybe in anything that could conduct sound. Daniel took a deep breath, finally understanding the true gravity of the situation. This was no longer an investigation. It was a matter of restraint. And they were late. Because whatever was down there, I was no longer just trying to leave. I was trying to expand. Daniel didn't sleep, not out of fear, but because there was now urgency. The pattern was too clear to ignore. It was learning, absorbing, adapting. And every minute inside that mansion increased the reach and the intelligence of what was trapped, or perhaps partially freed. He returned to Arthur's makeshift office before dawn. He spread all the documents out on the table, the old diary, the recent notebook, the redrawn maps, his own notes. For the first time, he wasn't just looking for answers. He was looking for strategy, because now there was an inescapable truth that could not be treated as a common phenomenon. It needed to be contained as something conscious. Daniel began to reorganize everything in chronological order. The engineer from the beginning of the century, the workers who abandoned the project, the decision to seal it off, the undocumented disappearances, and then Arthur. These were not isolated events. They were cycles. Something was found. They interacted with it. They were trying to contain it, and eventually, they failed. So what's the difference now? He muttered to himself. The answer was in Arthur's notebook. Daniel went back to the last pages. It's not a place, it's a passage. He remained motionless for a few seconds. Ticket. That changed everything. If it wasn't just a physical cavity, then sealing it with stone, wood, or earth would never be enough. They were trying to block a door without understanding what was on the other side. The office door opened abruptly. Thomas entered, visibly shaken. The whole house is making noise, he said bluntly. It's not just the basement anymore, it's in the plumbing, the walls, even the electrical system. Daniel nodded slowly. She's using the structure. She? Thomas repeated, tense. Daniel didn't correct it, because at that moment giving form helped with thinking. We need to get everyone out of here, said Daniel. Thomas hesitated. And leave that loose? It's not a matter of choice. It's a matter of damage control. Margaret appeared right behind, as if she already knew about the decision. I've already warned the few remaining employees, she said. They're leaving. Daniel stood up. Great. Now we need to go back downstairs. Thomas reacted immediately. Are you crazy? No, Daniel replied firmly. I was before, trying to understand it as something physical. Now I'm not anymore. He picked up the old diary and opened it to a specific page. They didn't just seal off the main entrance, he said, pointing. They created a standard, a boundary. Margaret approached. A symbolic limit? Functional, Daniel corrected. Those symbols on the arch aren't decorative. They're structural, a kind of language. Thomas frowned. Are you saying this is some kind of code? Daniel nodded slightly. And we have parts of it. The silence that followed was not one of doubt. It was an era of acceptance. For the first time, they weren't just reacting. They were starting to take action. Minutes later, the three were once again standing in front of the basement door. This time, the atmosphere was different. The air vibrated slightly, almost imperceptible but constant, as if the house were breathing. Daniel opened the door without hesitation. The descent was faster, more direct. But what they found down there wasn't the same. The tunnels were wider, not excavated, expanded. The walls bore new, fresh, deep marks, as if something had moved repeatedly there in the last few hours. "That's not possible," Thomas murmured. But Daniel did not answer. He was expecting it. When they arrived at the arched chamber, the change became even more evident. The opening had grown. The surrounding soil was looser, and the symbols, some were broken, interrupted, as if the code were being corrupted. Margaret placed her hand on her chest. "It's getting weaker." Daniel moved forward quickly, ignoring the sound that was beginning to emerge again from the opening. This time, more clearly, more organized, closer. He knelt before the symbols. He opened the old diary beside him, and he started comparing, line by line, shape by shape, sequence by sequence. "He's not finished," she said, realizing something crucial. "Who?" Thomas asked. "The engineer. They started something, but didn't finish it." The sound got louder. Now there was something beyond the rhythm, something familiar, fragments of voice, distorted but recognizable. "Open, to leave, see." Margaret retreated. "You're using words now." Daniel didn't stop. "Because he's learning faster." He found the point, an interrupted symbol, broken. "Here," he said. "What's in there?" Thomas asked. Daniel looked at him. The failure. Without wasting any time, he picked up a piece of charcoal from the ground and began to complete the symbol on the stone, following the diary's pattern exactly. The sound system reacted immediately. A strong impact came from the opening, closer, more aggressive. But Daniel continued. Another symbol, another trait, another pattern. The air grew heavier, the pressure increased, as if something were being compressed. "Is this working?" Thomas asked tensely. Margaret watched, motionless. "It's holding on," she said. Daniel finished the last stroke, and then silence. Absolute. Heavy. The opening didn't close completely, but it stopped expanding. The sound stopped, and the pressure decreased. Daniel remained kneeling for a few seconds, breathing deeply. He didn't win, but he learned. And most importantly, he acted correctly. When he stood up, his eyes looked different, but firm, clearer. He had finally understood his role. It wasn't just about investigating, not just surviving. It was to prevent it from going all the way through, because now he knew that was not invincible, but also it could not be destroyed, just contained. And the problem, it was still far from over. The silence that filled the chamber after Daniel completed the symbols brought no relief. It brought controlled instability. It was like holding something dangerous in your bare hands. It was still there. He was still pushing. But for now, it's on hold. Daniel observed the arch with absolute attention. The opening still existed, dark and deep, but it had stopped growing. The newly completed symbols seemed to pulse slightly under the lantern's light, as if they were active, not just decorating the stone, but supporting something invisible. "This won't hold forever," he said finally. Thomas let out a nervous laugh. "Great. So what's the plan? Wait for things to get worse again?" "No," Daniel replied. "The plan is to finish what they started." Margaret stepped forward. "You want to seal it completely?" Daniel nodded. "Not just closing the opening. Reactivate the entire system." He stood up and began walking around the chamber, quickly examining the walls. Now that he understood the logic, the details jumped out at him. The symbols weren't just on the arch. Fragments of them appeared at strategic points, as if forming a network. "This isn't a single stamp," he continued. "It's a circuit." Thomas frowned. "Like multiple connected points?" "Exactly. And some were destroyed over time, or by Arthur's excavation." The name brought an immediate sense of weight to the atmosphere. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. He didn't know. "I knew you were messing with something," Daniel corrected, "but I didn't know what it would do to him." Silence fell again, but it was brief, because a new sound emerged, not from the bow, but from the walls. A slight, almost imperceptible dragging motion, like something moving inside the structure. Further away, more widespread, Daniel realized it immediately. He's no longer focused here. Thomas became tense. "Like this. It's using up the space it's already gained," Daniel replied. "While we hold it here, it spreads out." Margaret placed her hand on her chest. "So it's too late already." Daniel firmly denied it. "Not yet, but we're close." He returned to the center of the chamber. "We need to reactivate all the points, every broken symbol, every interrupted connection." "What if we're wrong?" Thomas asked. Daniel looked directly at him. "So we open more." The response was curt, real. No room for illusions. Thomas took a deep breath, and he nodded. There was no other choice. They separated inside the chamber, following Daniel's instructions. Each one searched for fragments of symbols on the walls, on the floor, near the ancient excavations. The old diary remained open in the center, serving as a reference. Margaret was the first to find a critical point. "Here!" she called. Daniel approached quickly. An incomplete sequence, partially erased by humidity and time. "That's a knot," he said. "If you don't tie that up, the rest won't hold." He began to carefully trace the lines, following the pattern from the diary. His hands were steady, but the pressure in the room was increasing again. The air grew heavier, and then the sound returned, stronger, closer, but different. Now it wasn't just about rhythm, it was insistence. "Open, to leave, to enter." The words were fragmented, but becoming clearer each time. Thomas stopped working. "It's getting worse." "Continue," Daniel ordered, without taking his eyes off the symbol. Margaret remained focused, despite the slight tremor in her hands. Another impact, this time coming from inside the arch. More violent. The earth moved, the opening pulsed, as if something was trying to get through at the exact moment they were trying to stop it. Daniel finished the symbol, and the effect was immediate. The sound cut out, for a second, like an interference. "It worked," Margaret murmured. But the reaction was not one of retreat, it was an adjustment period. The sound is back, faster, more aggressive, as if he were learning what they were doing. Daniel froze for a moment. "She's reacting to the norms." Thomas looked at him, alarmed. "You said that was language." "And it is," Daniel replied. "And now she's trying to use it too." The next impact was the strongest yet. The entire structure of the chamber shook. Small cracks appeared around the arch. "He won't be able to hold on," Thomas shouted. Daniel glanced quickly around. We were almost there. Very little. "Last point," he said, advancing to the base of the arch. There, almost completely erased, was the central symbol, the most complex, the most important thing, and the most damaged. Margaret approached. "This one was never complete, was it?" Daniel analyzed the diary, and then he understood. "No." Thomas's eyes widened. "So how did it stay closed all this time?" Daniel answered without taking his eyes off the stone. "It didn't stay." The silence that followed was overwhelming. It was kept unstable. He looked up. This was never a perfect prison. It was an improvised containment. And now they were trying to finalize something that had never been completed. The sound increased dramatically. Now there was no doubt. Something was pressing directly against the opening. The form began to emerge again, more defined, closer, more present. Margaret retreated. Thomas was paralyzed. Daniel, however, knelt before the ultimate symbol. He didn't have all the answers, but I had enough. And for the first time, there was no more room for error, because the next stroke, it would determine whether that would be contained or finally released. Daniel did not hesitate. Faced with the incomplete symbol, and with the growing pressure of what emerged from the arch, he made the riskiest decision since entering that mansion, not just to copy, but to interpret. The old diary did not contain the complete final symbol. There were gaps, missing parts, or perhaps omitted. But now Daniel understood the reason. That last stroke wasn't just a closing, it was a choice. The sound emanating from the opening grew louder, becoming almost unbearable. It was no longer merely heard, it was felt. It vibrated in the bones, in the chest, in the air, all around. The dark shape already partially exceeded the limits of the arch, distorting the space around it as if reality itself were being squeezed. "Daniel!" Thomas shouted. "It's coming out!" But he didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the stone. According to standards, logically, in language, that wasn't just physical restraint, it was a communication, and all communication required two sides. The mistake of the previous ones was trying to silence them, seal, block, but it hadn't stopped. He just waited, he learned, and now it was stronger. Daniel gripped the coal more firmly, and instead of simply completing the symbol based on the old pattern, he did something different. He replied. The first stroke was made. Immediately the sound changed. It didn't stop, but he hesitated, as if something had been noticed. Margaret watched, motionless. "He's talking to it," she whispered. The shape in the arch receded slightly, not by force, but "Please pay attention," Daniel continued. Each stroke was no longer just repetition, it was adaptation. He maintained the original structure but corrected the flaws. He adjusted the sequence. He filled gaps based on what he had learned below. The environment reacted to every movement. When he got it right, the sound decreased. When he hesitated, the pressure increased. It was a fragile balance, dangerous, and then it happened. The shape suddenly advanced, more than before. A dark expanse jutted out from the opening, touching the floor of the chamber. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't just a shadow either. It moved like something alive, observing, feeling. And then came the voice, clearer, closer. "Open." Daniel didn't look back. "No," he said firmly. It was the first time he answered aloud. The effect was immediate. The sound stopped for a second, as if that didn't expect a response. "You're already here," he continued, keeping his hand firmly on the stone. "You don't need to leave." Thomas looked at Margaret, completely lost. "He's gone mad." But Margaret did not answer, because she understood. Daniel wasn't facing it. I was redirecting. The final stroke was near, but something was wrong. The pattern didn't quite fit. There was a missing connection, a link. Daniel paused for a moment, and then he realized it was not an isolated symbol. It was a living system, and he was beside himself. The understanding came with an immediate weight. "It's not just on the stone," he murmured. He looked at his own hands, covered in soil, just like Arthur, just like the others. Then he did something unexpected. He pressed his hand against the still, incomplete symbol. The earth on her skin touched the stone, and he completed the final stroke with his own touch. The effect was instantaneous. The sound disappeared. It hasn't decreased. It didn't fail. It disappeared. The shape froze, literally, stop, suspended, as if time had been interrupted at that point, and then it began to retreat, slowly, without resistance, no impact, without violence, like something that you accept. The opening began to close, not entirely, but enough. The symbols around the arc stabilized, forming a continuous pattern. For the first time, full. Daniel remained motionless, his hand still resting on the stone, feeling, not the weight, but the absence. But it was still there, contained in a different way. Thomas stepped forward, incredulous. "He finished." Daniel slowly withdrew his hand. He took a deep breath. "No." He looked at the arch. "It's stable now." Margaret approached. His eyes were fixed on the symbols. "You're finished." Daniel shook his head slightly. "I've changed." The silence that followed was no longer one of fear. It was a time of understanding, because at that moment, everyone realized that was not destroyed. He was not eliminated, but it was understood. That's why, finally contained. But there was a catch. One single detail that Daniel didn't mention. When he touched the symbol, he felt something coming back. No pain. It's not a threat, but presence and recognition. And that meant only one thing. That too. Now I knew him. The morning arrived far too quietly. The previous night's storm had completely vanished, as if it had never existed. Sunlight streamed through the mansion's tall windows, illuminating corridors that now seemed normal, but only on the surface. Biltmore stood as imposing as ever. To any outside observer, nothing had changed. No sign of destruction. No evidence of what had happened beneath that century-old structure. But for those who were down there, everything had changed. Daniel remained on the property for a few more hours after the incident. Not out of obligation, but out of necessity. He needed to be sure that the standard remained stable, and as far as I could tell, maintained. The arch remained intact, the complete symbols. The opening reduced to a tiny fissure, no longer active, no longer reacting, but it's still present. Always present. Thomas avoided going down again. He simply wandered around the house, checking structures, trying to find technical explanations for something he knew he didn't have. His behavior had changed. Less resistance, more caution. He no longer denied anything. I simply accepted it, without fully understanding. Margaret, on the other hand, demonstrated something different. Relief. Not complete relief, but enough. Like someone who carried a burden for years and finally saw a break, albeit a temporary one. "They tried to do the best they could with what they had," she said, looking out the window at the garden. "But they never understood." Daniel stood by her side. "It wasn't about closing down," he replied. "It was about maintaining balance." She nodded slowly. "And now?" Daniel took a few seconds to answer. "Now, she's quiet." Margaret turned to him. "Quiet is not the same as harmless. I know." The silence between the two was comfortable, but heavy with awareness. Nothing there had been definitively resolved, just stabilized. Before leaving, Daniel returned to Arthur Calloway's office. The atmosphere still bore traces of the obsession that had driven the tycoon to that point. Scattered maps, incomplete notes, attempts to understand something that was beyond common logic. Daniel picked up the notebook, not as proof, but as a responsibility. The last words were still there. "It's not a place, it's a passage." Now he knew. Arthur was right, but he made a fatal mistake. He tried to cross. Daniel closed his notebook and looked around one last time. The difference between them wasn't courage, it was the limit. Arthur wanted to go further. Daniel knew when to stop. As he left the property, the gates closed behind him with the same slow creak as when he arrived, but now the sound seemed different, less threatening, more definitive. He got into the car, but didn't start it immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the mansion for a few seconds, thinking, reorganizing everything, because despite everything seemingly being under control, there was something that could not be ignored. When he touched the symbol, that answered the question, not with an attack, not with resistance, but with recognition, and that changed everything. Daniel finally started the car, but before leaving, he said in a low voice, "You're not under arrest, are you?" No response came, only silence. But this time, the silence didn't seem empty, and for the first time since the beginning of the case, Daniel wasn't sure if he had prevented anything from escaping, or allowed that something would learn to stay. Weeks later, the Biltmore estate reopened to visitors. Trained guides led groups through the luxurious halls, telling stories about architecture, wealth, and tradition. No mention of what had happened, no reference to what lay beneath everyone's feet. The isolated wing remained closed, officially for maintenance, unofficially as a precaution. In an office some distance away, Daniel opened Arthur's notebook again. This time, there was something new. One line. That wasn't there before. The handwriting wasn't Arthur's, not even from him. The sentence was simple, direct. It's impossible to ignore. Now I know too. Daniel slowly closed the notebook, and for the first time, there was no doubt. That thing hadn't stayed in the mansion, and now I want to know from you. If you were in Daniel's place, would you have done the same? Would he have tried to understand or simply run away? Because the truth is that not all mysteries want to be solved. Some just want to be found. And when that happens, the question isn't whether you're ready. It's a question of whether you'll be able to come out the same way afterwards. If this story has captivated you this far, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, because there are many more stories like this, stories that seem like fiction, but leave you with that unsettling question. What if it's real? Also, leave your comment. Do you believe it was contained, or has it already found another way to spread? And tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has gone, because maybe she may have gone further than